Joining online, both our guests and those watching the webinar. Welcome to today's meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee. My name is Sakina Sheikh, and it's an honour to chair my first Planning and Regeneration Committee for the London Assembly, following on from Assemblymember Boff and previously Assemblymember Gavron. Members of the public may like to follow us on Twitter with the handle @LondonAssembly. And you can also use the hashtag #AssemblyPlanning for this meeting. Please may I remind participants to silence your devices as well as the committee members. And on the agenda today is a discussion on the London Plan Guidance with a specific focus on housing design standards, LPG, as well as small site design codes, LPG. For anyone who's had a look, you can see it's an ambitious agenda. It's broken down into two parts with two different panels, but we're confident that we can get through the business today. Now, before we begin the substantive part of the meeting, we have some items of business to get through first. These are slightly longer than usual, as this is the first meeting of the 22-23 municipal year. Can I now ask our committee clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meetings?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence have been received.
Fantastic. On to agenda item 2. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? That's your cue. Great. Can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in any specific items listed on the agenda? No. Great stuff. On to agenda item 3. Can I ask members to note the membership and chairing arrangements? No. Fantastic, and I'll just take this moment to congratulate Assemblymember Bess, who takes on the role as Deputy Chairman of the committee. Agenda item 4. Can we note the committee's terms of reference? Great. And then agenda item 5. Can we note the standing delegations of authority to me as chair of the committee as set out in the agenda and as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 9th of May 2022? Great. This is going smoothly so far. Agenda item 6, minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of the committee meeting on the 27th of January and that also held on the 8th of February 2022? Great. And agenda item 7. Little suspense while I take a sip of my water. Can we note the completed and outstanding actions arising from the previous meetings of this committee? No. Great. Agenda item 8. Can we note the action taken by the former chair of the committee under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members? And these are the letter to the mayor on opportunity areas and housing zones, as well as the report, open planning, community engagement and transparency when the mayor calls in planning applications. Is that agreed? Agreed. Great. Well, now on to the exciting part of the meeting. So this brings us on to the substantive part. As mentioned earlier, this meeting will be split into two sections. So we have two separate panel of guests. The first session is on housing design standards, LPG, and the panels in front of me. And the second will be on the small site design codes. A warm welcome to our first panel of guests on the housing design standards, LPG. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really grateful for your time and really appreciate your expertise. Before you're invited to speak, it'd be helpful if you could just introduce yourself by full name and your title. And I just wanted to use this opportunity to say we have no doubt that you all have a huge amount to contribute, which is why we were so excited to invite you. But we have a packed agenda and we want to make sure we get through it all. So if you could just limit your comments to the questions that are posed to you specifically, as opposed to those who are not, those aren't posed to you, that would be really helpful to make sure we can get through the business. And I'm sure we'll be having you back in the future. So I think we are good to go. I think before we begin with the questions, just in order to prove everyone who claims that the Planning and Regeneration Committee is the super geeky committee, we thought, absolutely, let's have a presentation. So we're going to start off with a 10-minute presentation from Alan, and then we'll be moving into the questions. So I'll pass over to you, Alan, if you could just introduce yourself, your title, and we can crack on with the presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Alan Smithies. I'm a senior strategic planner at the GLA, and I work in the London Plan team. So I'm just going to present a few slides on the London Plan guidance documents that are a focus of this committee meeting. And the first one, as you've mentioned, is the Housing Design Standards LPG. So before I do that, I'm just going to give a brief overview of the background to these documents. So previously known as the Good Quality Homes for All Londoners guidance, this suite of documents provides further guidance on a number of design and housing related policies in the London Plan. When first published for information only in March 2020, this guidance consisted of 4 modules, A, B, C and D, shown on the top of the screen there. During the formation of these documents, a sounding board comprised of mayoral design advocates, housing developers and borough representatives was set up. A workshop facilitated by the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust was held to engage young Londoners on the key quality of life indicators and also their priorities from their perspectives. And lastly, an urban design workshop was held with London boroughs. Following this, the guidance was formally consulted on as London Plan Guidance documents, or LPGs, between October 2020 and January 2021. And this consultation led to a number of changes to the documents, and as a result, each document has been significantly revised. And in particular, the documents were structured and renamed, with Module A being split into 2 documents. So you can see that on the screen there, that Module A is now being replaced with 2 documents, the Characterisation and Growth Strategies, LPG, and the Optimising Site Capacity, a Design-Led Approach, LPG. And these changes were in response to the consultation feedback and new national policy and guidance, such as the National Model Design Code document, as well as changes in the MPPF. And there were also changes made responding to or brought forward by the COVID pandemic and the continued threat of climate change. So as a result, a second public consultation was carried out in March this year on a revised suite of documents to provide another opportunity to get feedback. These are shown on the bottom of the screen, or these documents are shown on the bottom of the screen and have been referred to as the Design and Characterisation LPGs. And it's the 2 documents on the right-hand side, the Housing Design Standards LPG and the Small Site Design Codes LPG, that are of focus today. So this slide shows how the suite of documents work together. So the documents on the left-hand side are those relating to the local plan making stage. In particular, this includes, as I've mentioned, the Characterisation and Growth Strategies LPG, which feeds into the Small Site Design Codes work, which is a focus today. And these documents focus on plan making and the engagement with communities at that stage, or at this stage of the planning process. Conversely, on the right-hand side of the screen is the Housing Design Standards LPG, which is relevant when assessing applications at the planning application stage. This document sets out a number of housing standards that should be met for all residential planning applications, and it's particularly relevant to urban designers and architects of residential developments. So, in terms of the 2 public consultations that have been held, I've included a number of statistics for each one on the slide. For each consultation, the suite of documents was consulted upon, and therefore the statistics shown are for the consultation as a whole. For each consultation, the GLA held a number of engagement events to seek the opinions of stakeholders. We received a large range of responses from a diverse range of stakeholders, and these include community groups, local authorities, businesses, professional bodies throughout London. And we've also had specific support and input from several MDAs, or mayoral design advocates, when revising the documents. So before I go on to review the LPGs, I just want to touch on the project timescales. So as I've mentioned, the documents were consulted upon in March this year, and as a result, we're currently reviewing the consultation responses and engaging with different stakeholders. And then the next steps are to revise the documents to reflect the feedback, with an aim to publish the final versions of the documents in autumn, winter 2022. So I'm going to now turn to the Housing Design Standards LPG. So this guidance aims to raise the bar in terms of residential quality in London. The guidance is applicable to all residential development in London that fall under the C3 use class, as such, it is not applicable to other forms of housing such as shared living, temporary accommodation and student accommodation. It is primarily, the document this is primarily aimed at developers and their design teams seeking planning permission and also borough development management officers when assessing those applications. The standards express what it means to optimise site capacity for residential development as opposed to simply maximising the development of a site. And the document aims to be what we're referring to as a one-stop shop for designers and architects for residential development. And it also aims to address the impacts of the COVID pandemic and the risk of and to climate change. It introduces a set of best practice standards which aim to raise the design quality of residential development even further. So as mentioned earlier, the document has been revised significantly since it was first part of the Good Quality Homes for All Londoners guidance. This has been in response to a number of key areas of feedback. So these include a concern that the document was too lengthy and wordy, a need to update the guidance to reflect the changing needs of Londoners in the wake of the COVID pandemic. There was also suggestions that the guidance could push further on environmental matters. And lastly, there were a number of suggested amendments to specific standards. For instance, there was a concern that a few extracts from the BRE guidance on daylight and sunlight was being used as a housing standard. These led to the document being significantly revised with key changes including firstly a slimming down of the document by removing much of the supporting text. This has led to the document going from 83 pages to 29 pages. The document has also been restructured to align more closely with the design process. So the revised document now has 3 sections. The first, Part A, focusing on standards relating to placemaking in the public realm. Then Part B, focusing on shared and auxiliary spaces. And then finally Part C, focusing on design aspects relating to the home and private outside space. And then finally, a set of best practice standards have been added to the document, and then a number of standards have been amended, revised and removed. And so this includes, for instance, the removal of 2 standards relating to daylight and sunlight that specifically reference 2 elements of the BRE daylight and sunlight guidance. This decision was made as it was considered that the BRE guidance should be referenced as a whole, which the LPG now does. It was also felt that it provides detailed technical guidance with multiple assessment methods. This is the BRE guidance that needs to be read as a whole, and also that the BRE guidance is clear that it should not be seen as an instrument of planning policy. As a result, the standards now focus on the qualitative outcomes that we want to achieve for the space rather than copying a few parts of existing national guidance out of context of the rest of the guidance. So instead, the guidance addresses aspects relating to daylight and sunlight in a number of other standards, including standards A 1.7, 1.8, 2.2 and B 9.5, and then the standards C 4.1 through to C 4.8. So we're also intending to amend the document further to reflect the second public consultation. So the key feedback during this second public consultation were as follows. So firstly, that most respondents were supportive of the reduced length, but that there was a concern about the increased number of standards. There was also a desire to have more clarity on some of the standards. As a result, we're considering amending some of these further and also introducing a series of illustrations to support designers in the understanding of the standards. And in terms of the best practice standards, there is a mixture of support and concern for them and how they're presented. So this slide reviews how the guidance has changed in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the changing needs of Londoners. In particular, this revised document now requires designers and architects to take account of and design for the shift to increased home working. This includes a best practice standard for new homes to provide a dedicated study room as well as additional storage, and the document also sets out a new best practice space standard that aims to increase the size of homes. Sure. The guidance also reiterates the importance of designing homes with flexibility and choice in mind. As a result, the section C3 focuses on this aspect of design and sets out how designers should demonstrate how space can be easily modified. And lastly, the guidance sets out a number of housing standards which advocate for even greater access to and availability of green open space in new developments. So I'm nearly there, but the revised document reiterates the importance to inclusive and accessible homes and communal spaces in order to assist London in becoming a more equal city. This is done through different parts of the document. For instance, in Part A, Standard A 2.2 states that that large developments should aim to deliver a wide range of housing tenures and typologies and respond to specific local needs such as specialist housing for older people and multi-generational housing. Furthermore, Standards A 5.1, 5.2 and 5.3 address the accessibility to public realm and require development to be tenure blind and for non-residential amenities such as gyms, pools and shared workspaces to be accessible to all residents and ideally the wider community. There are also some standards in Part B that address access requirements for shared and communal spaces, advocating that they should be accessible and available to all occupants regardless of tenure. And lastly, in Part C, standards addressing issues of inclusion and accessibility within the home. These are located in section C1 of the guidance, which sets out 5 standards relating to that. So lastly, and this is the last slide, improving environmental sustainability of development is a central aim of this guidance. In particular, there are a number of design standards that address environmental sustainability. In Part A, these include standards A 1.2, 1.7, 1.13 and 1.17. These standards advocate for the retainment and reuse of existing buildings, that the orientation of new buildings should maximise the quality of daylight and aid thermal comfort, and that developments are designed with circular economy in mind, are lean, thermally efficient, and minimise whole-life carbon emissions. In Part B, these include standards in Part B7 and B8 of the document, and these require development to be green and clean, relating to the energy hierarchy. Lastly, in Part C, Section C6 of the guidance sets out a number of standards on optimising thermal efficiency within the home. So that's a brief overview of this LPG, and I'll pass back over to the chair.
Thank you very much for that, Alan. That was really helpful, and I feel like that clarity will hopefully guide the rest of our conversation. I know that we've got Elliot online as well, who will be speaking alongside you on this. So I'll start off by asking you both questions regarding the presentation, specifically on the second consultation, so the round that closed this February. What was done to encourage a more diverse range of people to respond to it? So I'm not sure if yourself or Elliot will go first on this, and it might be worth having the slides come down now and bringing back our guests on screen, if that's possible. Great.
Great. Okay, so yeah, I'll start. I mean, ensuring that there's a diverse range of responses and that we're reaching the most and diverse range of Londoners has been a really important aspect. And as such, we held a number of different events, both GLA events, which we advertised. We're working with colleagues in our comms team to make sure that was, the word was spread out. But then we also did a number of other engagement events through other means and other organisations. So, things like Urban Design London, we did a number of engagement events through them, ALBPO, All Borough Planning. We did a presentation there as well. So we've tried to reach a real diverse range of Londoners to ensure that the word is out there and that we can seek a diverse range of feedback. I don't know if Elliot wants to add anything.
No, I don't have anything further to add.
Grant, I mean, I might push you further on this because that doesn't sound hugely diverse to me, if I'm going to be really frank. That sounds like very traditional planning outreach. And I think something the committee is really keen on this year is to ensure that we do make sure we have a diverse range of voices contributing to the future of planning in London. So maybe you could just offer a few more specifics. Obviously, you've talked about Urban Design London and ALPBO and the work with the comms teams and engagement teams. But in terms of maybe non-traditional planning stakeholders, what was the efforts done to reach out to them?
I might come in on this. So yeah, I'll introduce myself. I'm Elliot Kemp. I'm in the London Plan team, and I'm a policy team leader on heritage design and environment. We have a database of people that have a large database of people that we notify about all our consultations, but also we have media sort of channels such as Twitter and Talk London to get the word out that these consultations are running, and obviously links to the relevant websites, and trying to make we have a new sort of online tool that we use for web engagement and consultation feedback that makes it as easy as possible for people to contribute rather than more traditional sort of emails and letters feedback.
Thank you very much for that, Elliot. So I don't know if it's keen to start off on the first question with an outcome already for the committee, but I feel like just given that this is a shared agenda, it'd be really fantastic at some point to dig into that database and review it, see who's on that and who's perhaps missing, so that we can begin to build that up and make sure that it is reaching as diverse an audience as possible. Because I think what you've sort of said, Alan, in your presentation about the changes from Consultation 1 to Consultation 2 is really significant. I think it's really fantastic to see that change, and I think we're all impressed with the detail. But, it could be, I suppose, better, and a wider range of voices contributing to those changes will help that. My second question, I think, has been covered, so I'm happy to move on to Assemblymember Boff for his question.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Ms. Gbolade, how do these standards meet Londoners' changing needs, and how do they allow for flexibility in how people can use their homes?
Thank you for that. I think the standard...
Would you just be able to start off by introducing your full name and your title?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I'm Tara Gbolade. I'm an architect and co-director of Gbolade Design Studio. I'm also a mayor's design advocate. In terms of how these standards meet London's changing needs, I think they do so in a few ways. One is certainly the pandemic and how the building standards have been pushed and challenged in this. So looking at space standards and how they are perhaps larger than we would normally expect at this stage. The second is certainly looking at climate change, and the standards here specifically focus on the increased quality and increased quality of buildings and of homes. So here there's a stress on the design process from orientation, placemaking, through to shared amenities, so shared lobbies, for example, when we're looking at flat layouts, and then right down to the homes and the fabric first approach that's been adopted for how houses will be used. Specifically with the flexibility question, I think the standards have also included policy points on standard points on perhaps where structural walls will be placed outside the key party walls, so that internally rooms can be manipulated in future to change the needs and requirements of those who use those spaces.
You mentioned that the pandemic has had an effect on the design codes, and that there's a greater there's now an expectation for larger homes. Sorry, yeah?
Can I add that?
Yes, please.
Specifically, there I'm referring to the promotion of space dedicated for working from home, for example. So recognizing that more people will require more flexible working, and working from home will be accommodated. Some working from home could now be accommodated in homes. So looking at where spaces can be accommodated within the existing home, or indeed pushing boundaries with best practice to look for increased space for dedicated work from home spaces. And that's what I'm
But that wasn't the only challenge that the pandemic brought around, of course. And I believe there's data to suggest that proximity contributed to that disease spreading, and also the availability of. And I know somebody else has got a question on this, and I don't want to tread on their toes too soon. But also things like the availability of gardens. Has that been recognised in the design standards?
Yes, absolutely. I believe so. I think there are three key points that I think are really helpful with these. One is the first really looks at the design process, so looking at placemaking and public realm. So your point about garden space, but also shared amenity space, so courtyards, and the quality of those as well. Introducing far more green infrastructure has been encouraged within the standards, ensuring that the quality of these spaces are more useful to those who would be to residents, in effect. The other is the shared amenity spaces that you've started to highlight, and the ancillary spaces. So taking advantage of aspects like green roofs, for example, and courtyards, and ensuring that they're accessible to a wide variety of people.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I trod a little too much on somebody else's question, but thank you for that. I think we can move on to the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman Buff. I'll bring in Assemblyman Baker next.
My question is around various diverse needs of different communities to Andrea and David. So how will these standards, how do you believe these standards, oh my word, am I? I normally put the things on. How will these standards change the way that developers carry out meaningful engagement with residents and communities? And what do you think a sign of successful change would be? Andrea, did you want to lead on?
Hi, I'm Andrea, Carey, the representative today from Just Space. I've worked with Just Space through Neighbourhood planning, which is how I know Richard, and I'm the coordinator of Deptford Neighbourhood Forum. Yes, in terms of engagement of communities, I do feel that the only way we were effectively able to engage communities in the process for our neighbourhood planning under Regulation 14 was to get a specific amount of funding, which we got from Trust for London actually, and we went out to the communities, because those hard-to-reach communities are people that are just surviving day to day. They don't have time or the resources to go to events or to sort of come to things that may be set up by whether it's architects or the GLA or whatever. And I think you need to engage the community themselves. So one of the things we did, for example, on the Silwood estate in our area, which is an estate that's kind of, just by the geography of the way it's set out, is separated by a bit of Southwark, but it's it's not even connected to the other part of Lewisham. It's on the edge of Deptford. Was to actually enlist the support of a community development worker there who engaged 2 young people, and we provided resources in terms of a laptop and printer, materials. They decided they'd like to put on a fish and chip event, and they had the materials exhibited in the local church, and they got people out to that because there was something in it for them to encourage them to come out as well and to take part. And I think it's another one of our sort of volunteers was a mum herself, and she went to the school gates and spoke to the parents and the children actually at the school gates, and trying to sort of ask the children what's important to them in terms of play, for example, or what kind of house they wanted to live in. So there's sort of ways to actually take the the ideas direct to the communities that are hard to get to for whatever reason. And I think early on, one of the other things we did was there was a Vietnamese cultural event, and we asked them if we could have a table at their event, and we helped support their event in order to get their views at that event. So I think it's really important to sort of look at the ways that you do these things, identify the communities that you're looking to sort of get involved in terms of asking them questions, and to make it accessible in terms of language and finding out what's important for them. And one of the things that I wanted to refer to was in the Just Space community-led recovery plan that very much suggests that the Mayor should create community review panels and citizens' assemblies made up of community members, and use criteria designed to give priority to smaller grassroots organisations and members of communities that have historically been disadvantaged by the planning system. Because even looking at things like equality impact assessments, they don't cover, in terms of priority groups, people like homeless people or asylum seekers, so and refugees. So, it's sort of looking at those kind of issues in relation to, the design codes or policies that you've got together, which, by the way, I think are really good and really moving things forward in terms of looking at a holistic approach to design in planning.
That's really helpful. Thanks,
Okay.
Alan. Seeing you, I just want to ask Andrea just a quick follow-up, and then I'm going to ask David, and then I'll come to Alan. Is that all right?
Okay.
So that's really helpful. I think that really sort of sums up what meaningful engagement would look like from the other end. And is there I see you appreciate some of the stuff in the standards we're looking at today.
Yeah.
Is there anything in it that you think facilitates that type of engagement? Do you think that moves us on to be more?
I'm not sure, because forgive me, because I've gone through most of it, but I haven't seen a kind of
that's totally
an outline of what effective community engagement might look like, or examples. Is there anything like that within this? And maybe that's something that Just Space could kind of, it could be like an appendix to this in terms of suggestions for how to improve the engagement over these new standards, to look at what people themselves think about them and what they might feel is missing for them. Because it's very hard for me to speak as a white person for a lot of different black and cultural communities. I couldn't do that. Do you know what I mean? You need to ask them themselves what they would like to see. That's why I would suggest maybe considering an extra piece of work with Just Space and maybe neighbourhood forums across London as well, to look at sort of what input they could give in terms of the engagement around this.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
That's fine. David, can I come to you first?
Sure. Hello, I'm David Stronge, Design Director at Peabody, and also registered architect. I think so. The question around meaningful engagement, what I'd like to propose is that perhaps Peabody is the type of organisation that really does wish to do that through its new build developments, and has been doing so for some time, and can bring to mind a couple a number of examples. I think that there's two ways to look at it in terms of new planning applications, that you have a site or a context specific engagement plan, and we also engage with, there are other parts of the GLA that we engage with in relation to post occupancy evaluation, where we solicit the feedback from our residents anywhere between 1 and 2 years after moving in, so we get meaningful feedback from a diverse group of people, our residents, through that process. It doesn't happen on 100% of our developments, but we do pick a sample size. So that's one source. And for new planning applications, again, we've got some significant. The word proportionate is used in the document, and I think that's important. And I think we've got, on our larger schemes, some really, really meaningful examples of that engagement through multiple channels, whether that's online, setting up a specific website, holding face-to-face community events, or the equivalent during pandemic shutdowns, etc. But I think the part of your question around the signs of success, for me, that's the difference that it has made to the design from where you started to where it ended up, and being able to evidence that kind of journey. And so, we certainly have on one of our significant schemes in North London, where we started is not where we finished, and we ended up with significant improvements around connectivity through the site, amenities, types of amenities, and the quantity of them on the site, and the quality then of the ones that had been there prior to the consultation, but not so much the quantity has changed, but the quality of them and the mixed use of them has changed. So I think those are signs of success, where it actually makes a real difference to the design then that goes in for planning.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And just again, follow-up, apologies, Chair, just so these standards specifically, do you feel that it helps sort of direct the engagement you have in terms of what sort of things that the standards say are the most important? Is that how it might help you in the future direct that engagement? Yeah,
it certainly comes out that's a push and a requirement, and specifically point A 5.6 about evidencing your community engagement strategy with reference to multiple types of engagement is a specific ask, yeah, which is very useful. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks.
Alan waited very patiently there.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say, I absolutely agree with everything that the member from Just Space was saying about the importance of community and resident involvement. And I think I just wanted to raise that, this is a suite of documents, and we've definitely tried to reiterate the importance of community and resident involvement and engagement within the standards themselves. As David has just mentioned, there's the standard A 5.6, which is about community engagement strategy. And then we've also got one C 1.4, which is about undertaking community engagement to identify any specific cultural requirements within the local community that need addressing within the design. And the housing standards LPG ultimately is for designers and architects, and is at the planning application stage, and that's why I raised the point about the other suite of documents, because the other suite of documents at the local plan making stage, we've absolutely tried to ensure that resident involvement, community involvement at the local plan making stage is reiterated in those documents, because actually that's where we feel that actually there's a huge amount, a real opportunity, if you like, because by the time developments have got to the planning application stage, yes, we're asking them to evidence what they've done, which is what we should do, and this is what the Housing Standards LPG does. But ultimately, for that meaningful engagement, we also feel that engaging residents and communities at the local plan making stage on developments before they've come to planning application stage is an even better, more optimum solution. So I just wanted to just raise that.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm going to ask some questions about the climate emergency and also green space, and they're quite closely linked together. So if I want to start with Andrea, if that's all right. On both of those issues, which are obviously very, very inextricably linked, do you feel that the standards that are set out now in those documents go far enough to meet the challenges of the climate emergency? And how will they act to ensure that we get the new buildings that we deserve? And then the same question in relation to green space and the benefits that can bring. How well are these documents now doing?
Hi, I think they're making a positive step forwards. I've sort of highlighted some of them I wanted to mention, but sometimes the wording is still a bit woolly. I'd like to see definite commitments. I think there was one on the circular economy that I highlighted to myself, and I thought it would be good, to see design with the circular economy in mind. So it's not a kind of a sort of incorporate word that's used in other parts of the document, which is a more kind of definite intent. And I'll give you a comparison with our neighbourhood plan, one that we've got here, that basically says all development is encouraged to use energy, circular economy and whole life cycle carbon assessments throughout the pre-application process and design progression to demonstrate and maximise outcomes for London Plan policy, minimising greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm not sure if the design with the circular economy in mind is getting to all stages of the process, if you see what I mean, in comparison. Obviously, the healthy streets approach and everything is what we would expect to see in a sort of a move forward. But there's also, I'm just trying to find the right bits that I've highlighted. Incorporate trees in new streets unless there are compelling reasons not to do so. We had a policy where we were looking for developers to actually input new trees into developments, and we really would like to see almost sort of one tree per new home kind of thing in terms of increasing tree cover, not just in terms of the cooling aspects and shade, but also nature and biodiversity and cleaning up the air. So I think that, there are good things in here, but we've got a whole suite in our neighbourhood plan, for example, that's focused on child-friendly design. And it's, as we know, everything's interconnected, and it's about, we know from Child in the City and organisations like that, that if environments are good for children, they're good for everybody. And I would really love to see, again, sort of maybe a little section related to this, because things are sort of set out like streets, public open space and things like that, but actually focusing on children, so what it means for child-friendly design. So let me just give you a couple examples in our child-friendly Deptford. So it's got development is encouraged to demonstrate how internal layouts have regard to adequate space for children and young people, birth to 17 years, providing privacy to play, do their homework, have their friends to visit and interact with parents and other adults, e.g. space in the kitchen for a chair to allow for conversation, to help with food preparation space in their bedroom and or living room, to do homework, space for books and materials. So we've talked about space standards in relation to people working from home, but we need to look at space standards for children, because increasingly with these kind of modular type flats that are being built, there's not much storage space contained within them, or even space for children for books and homework, PE kits, play, being able to watch their parents cook or to learn how to cook and things like that. So there's things like that. And one of the key things for us is children having access to nature, because as you know, you were one of the key supporters along with Len Duval to save Tide Mill Garden, and it was sort of, the whole idea was to keep nature spaces, because there's lots of sort of built play spaces, but children are increasingly having less access to true nature and biodiversity, and they need that,
can I ask
in
a
terms
follow-up
of their
on
immune
that?
systems. Yes, of course.
This is what my colleague was alluding to earlier on.
Okay.
Do you have a view, as a group and as an individual, on the value of a rooftop play space in comparison with somewhere that's more on the ground and related to the surrounding area?
Yeah, I think it's important for children to be grounded in nature, And I think rooftops are great for solar panels and for green roofs, and maybe even for rooftop flats with some green growing space. But really for children, in terms of connection to nature, nature's connected mainly through the ground, through trees or brambles, you know, blackberries, butterflies, bees, etc. like that. But I think it's important to have nature play spaces where you can have like a tyre swing attached to a tree. It's very difficult if it's on a roof and not very safe.
Probably banned, yeah.
Yes, totally impractical. And even things like sand pits and stuff like that. You know, I think it's vital that, you know, sort of if you're looking at studies, you know, there was one called, was it Growing Seeds or something like that, about children and access to nature that have been done. It's really important. Like when I was growing up, we used to have those rough land and we used to go out on our bikes and, you know, watch butterflies, you know, catch butterflies to identify them, obviously let them go, but pick, you know, blackberries and things like that. And there's increasingly fewer of these spaces around, especially in a very densified city like London. And that's why I think it's very important that nature and natural play spaces are built into these environments, or if environments or new developments are being built around them, that they are maintained and saved and not replaced with, you know, sort of formal pathways with a tiny few bits of green which don't have the same value to a child as a space that can grow food, and they can grow food, or they can plant flowers and they can be in nature.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I need to turn to Tara now for some further comments on the sustainability standards that are now in there, and whether or not they're really going far enough in terms of the climate emergency. Obviously, we've just talked about green spaces there and other issues, but I wanted to particularly ask you about demolition and retention of existing buildings. Do you think there's enough in there about that? I've just been flicking through the documents, looking at the worked examples, particularly in the site capacity guidance. There's no example there where there's an example where you're retaining an existing building, for example. Is there enough in there to help people to do retrofit and incorporate existing infrastructure?
Thank you. I think it certainly starts to move in the right direction in terms of certainly the standard A1.2 highlights make every attempt to retain and reuse existing built structure, but specifically it identifies applicants need to demonstrate the benefits of demolition if demolition is not appropriate. I think here it's important to recognize that, first of all, retention of existing structures is critical. We are in a climate emergency. We recognize the embodied carbon and energy that has already gone into built structure, and I think that this starts to move in the right direction in terms of placing that emphasis on the retention of existing buildings and existing structures and working within them. I think what it also starts to nod to is the because it specifically highlights actually the whole life carbon assessment. So really thinking about the embodied carbon, not just existing structure and operational energy as we start to develop or perhaps convert buildings, but actually because we're looking at existing buildings, understanding the embodied carbon, and then it starts to move towards, at least as a designer, move towards thinking about other materiality. So when we're thinking about insulation or perhaps facade treatment, really thinking about the materials that and the low embodied low embodied carbon materials that can be that follows on. So I think the fact that it highlights it here means that as a designer we're thinking about it, and it moves in the direction that certainly in industry we're already moving with other guidance and best practice that's moving towards this direction of really valuing embodied carbon as much as operational energy.
Okay, thank you. And were you involved in the development of these documents?
Not this particular document. I am involved sort of more broadly in the industry with other documents on sustainable performance standards. So
So yeah, that's useful to know. So in terms of, I mean, this is planning guidance, so it can only be about the implementation of what's in the London plan. Do you feel like the London plan itself is offering enough of a hook for the really highest standards to be put into these documents?
I do think that the London plan is doing that. It's challenging us beyond what's, I think, the general building regulation standards challenges us with. So because we have this higher standard that we're working towards, we have specifically been asked that, highlighted that major developments should be net zero carbon. So it's a standard that we have to work towards, and that's what we're working towards. So because it's incorporated within these standards and the wider London plan, I do think so.
Okay, just finally to give you a chance to, is there anything else you'd like to say about the green spaces issue and whether or not the standards do enough to make sure people have access to high quality green space and the benefits that can provide? Because the green spaces is highlighted, and I absolutely take your point about grounding. I do think it's important to recognise the different qualities of green space and who it attracts. Absolutely, children and young people in grounded spaces, perhaps, but other users, and ensuring that there are a variety of ways that we're able to use green space, but also thinking about green space not just in a particular development, but in its wider context. So recognizing there might be a park down the street, or there might be opportunities for greening particular streets. So thinking about, it speaks specifically about green infrastructure in a wider context. I think in many cases, one is used to looking at the red line boundary of a particular site, but taking a longer lens and looking far wider gives us an opportunity to be able to create green spaces that are unique to places, but also that complement rather than compete with other types of spaces.
Thank you very much, Simon Berry. Alan, I know you indicated, so if you could keep it very short so we could continue with the rest of the questions and stick to time.
Yeah, sure. It was just on the point about case studies and whether the documents are doing enough. And I guess I just wanted to shout out in the characterisation and growth strategies LPG, there's a specific bit and photo and image of the King's Cross redevelopment, particularly focused at Granary Square, the railway yards, and the reuse of the gas holders. So because I think we're keen to celebrate the reuse of buildings.
You picked a good example. That was heavily involved in that application for the whole area, and there were far too many buildings were knocked down there. But there you go.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Both.
If I may just ask one quick question on the previous section, we expect to what Ms. Gbolade said. We expect developers to adhere to the design statements, the ambitious design statements on sustainability. But do we expect the Mayor himself to stick to those standards? Because as I understand it, of the current affordable housing programme, none of those homes actually stick to those standards and will have to be retrofitted. Are you aware of that?
So for clarity, are you referring to new developments?
New developments, yes, but they haven't been as ambitious, and they're currently building homes that will have to be retrofitted. So to what extent can we get the Mayor himself to follow his own guidance?
I think as designers, this is what we focus on ensuring that we are meeting the standards and exceeding these standards. Of course, there are varying interests at play, but as designers and working with larger design teams, this is our priority. This is my personal priority, to ensure that we are designing to high quality sustainability standards. And
thank you. I just wish the Mayor was as ambitious as you are. Thank you very much. If I can move on to Mr. Woodward, who's from the Garden Museum. What concerns do you have about the overshadowing of tall buildings?
It's to do with, we came into this through a local park. We're not a campaigning body. We were just involved with our neighbours in contesting an application for a big £500 million of tall buildings. And from the horticultural perspective, plants need three things. They need sunlight, they need warmth, and they need water. And one of the issues with the BRE was to do with the winter time and warmth in particular, because a bulb won't grow if the ground is too cold. It's to do with the enzymes and the glucose and stuff. But if somewhere's overshadowed in winter, seeds and bulbs don't grow. But I think when we put together some research, you quickly extend from horticulture into biodiversity. You've talked about butterflies. You've seen how many, there's been quite a big impact on butterfly habitats with overshadowing because of the temperature triggers in parts of London. There's been increasing evidence of issues of both mental and physical health. If you, in the report we did, if you read Sam Everington, who's a remarkable person close to here, he talks about how, certainly when I grew up, we were told about rickets was something that was a warning to young children to go outside, but it was a vanished disease, but it's back quite significantly in Tower Hamlets owing to vitamin D deficiency, where he says about, I think, half of his patients have vitamin D deficiencies, and that leads you into COVID, of course, because there's a growing body of work, and that also leads you into ethnicity and COVID. There was a new paper for Public Health England about the relationship between vitamin D deficiency, mortality of COVID in black and Asian ethnic minority groups, with more research needed, but evidence suggesting there is a relationship, which all takes us back to sunlight and parks. So I think this has been great for us because the consultation has been got a good experience. Thank you. We did a petition which you helped with, and it had over 10,000 signatures, which I think is a significant number of people to take an interest in planning policy. I think BRE is behind us. That word overshadowing is quite critical because when you come into this, you're up against a whole industry of lighting. You as volunteers are battling huge computer models made at the expense of tens of thousands of pounds by consultancies who even now will be, right now people like Point 2 will be looking at that line, which is great. It's great that the public realm is not unduly shadowed. People at Point 2 are already looking at that line to what they call push the envelope and to push the boundaries of overshadowing.
So as far as you're concerned, within the design ambitions of the mayor, that we have some protection?
Yeah, no, this is good. Effectively, the sky is precious, and the sky has been effectively put up for sale in recent years because tall buildings all take a piece out of the sky. Every penthouse casts a shadow on a local park. And that's been a very big accumulative process, and this is a step in a very different direction. I think what we would ask for as a next step, it's one thing is obviously this is housing, and that's great, but there's mixed use, so the skyscrapers could come back with flats, offices, but not fall under C3 and cast a shadow over the park, and this wouldn't apply. So it's also, I think there's a whole area of uncertainty about what is a park, what is King's Cross, which is a great example, Kidbrooke, close to where I live, very, very good example of planning. Is that shared space? Is that public realm? And certainly one of the issues with the BRE was that a single use of the word park was picked up on about 10 years ago by developers. BRE is brilliant for putting together blocks of flats, light wells, stairwells. It's a very, very good technical piece of work, but it wasn't intended for parks. But there was a kind of creep because of the use of the word park on one page of that document. So something saying a science-based approach to the green environment, about people, plants, pollinators. I think that's what the planning system needs, and London is, leading the way with this.
If we stick to it, there's of course about well over 200 tall buildings in the pipeline in London, which have permission and not yet to be built. So.
Yeah, no, exactly, and it's quite scary when you come up against it. And it's not like this business about light is not an innocent confusion. The person we couldn't get to write for the report was like the play guy. He's called Tim. If he's not called Tim, he's sort of Tim. He's a nice person. And I was saying, why won't you put your name on the report? And he goes, I can't. He was too nervous of having his name. He said, I'll lose too much business from developers if I contribute. We had to work through documents. It was really bitter. That was more internal stuff about phrases being taken out, put back in. It was light is a big battleground, and I think again what is good about this is that it hasn't really been talked about. It's exciting that we're talking about it now here. Sunlight has not previously been discussed in planning.
We talked a lot about it during the decisions about Bishopsgate goods yard, and that was more overshadowing other people's properties than gardens.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, again, in recent years, the whole relationship between mental health and overshadowing is quite significant. You read many accounts of people who are depressed when they live on the ground floor of social housing. There's a lot to do. I mean, I'm not a scientist, I'm an art historian, but there is this big body of research, and it would be great if there was some, as said, science-based approach to healthy urban design. And, you know, we're in a borough, Tower Hamlets, which is one of the worst in Britain for access to green space. It's a very real thing.
This committee has done some work on tall buildings
right.
In the past, but one of the things we didn't touch on really was the psychological effects of the lack of light. And I'd be very grateful. I know it's not. You say it's not your subject, but I'd be very grateful if you could point us in those directions at a later time.
So in that document, Dr. Sue Stewart-Smith, who's written a book on health and gardening, and happens to be married to the landscape designer Tom Stewart-Smith, so it's an interesting. She puts lots of, it's things like people going into hospital, they get out quicker if they have sunshine. I mean, there's a dozen of these studies, and I think she showed me some videos, and it's just, we've all seen it, where children gravitate, everyone sits on the sun, not yesterday, everyone sits on the sunny bench, children gravitate towards sunshine, and one of the things that we won this public inquiry, but one of the issues with our park opposite the museum was that yes, you scrape through with 2 hours of sunlight under the old system, but setting aside the fact that that didn't address winter, the playground would get those 2 hours between 11 and 1 p.m. So when the kids were at school, so there's a whole world of development to come from this, and everyone knows why high rise works, because of those economies of profit. Once you get above 12, 13 stories, you start to make exponentially large sums of money.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Assembly-Member Berry, and just before you come in, I think it sounds like there is some follow-up, so if you're able to send us any of that information, Chris, and your report as well, I'm sure the committee would be very delighted to read it. Thank you. Assembly-Member Berry.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Alan and Elliot from the GLA. How do you expect developers to use the guidance to measure the impact of residential buildings on the green spaces and public spaces now? Will they be pushing the envelope of your new wording, do you think?
I can come in, Alan. Sorry.
Oh, go for it. And I'll pass to my colleague Elliot.
I think the way that we've sort of tried to make the standards work is to talk about the important things that you want to achieve in the design. So these are different standards. Talk about where you want the daylight or sunlight to be, and what the important amenities are. So it's giving us a clear steer to the designer as intended by the document, but also to the development management officer when they're assessing it, to be looking at, okay, so where are these different amenities? How is the site designed? How is the green spaces designed and laid out in relation to any taller element in the development? And so it's easier, because obviously the sort of BRE guidance is incredibly technical, and you rely on another expert to translate it, to translate the report for you, even if you're a development management officer. And so by putting it in sort of more simple, qualitative language about what the design should achieve, we're hoping it's easier that we get a better quality design at the end of the day.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, one of the things that the Garden Museum and other campaigners were concerned about was the previous wording that seemed to put into stone the BRE guidance about 2 hours during March. That's now gone, and you now have the more flexible, vaguer wording, not unduly overshadowed. Would you consider actually putting in the higher standard that they've asked for, which is the 6 hours of sunlight, or have you were asked to do that in the consultation before, and you've not done that? Why not?
We decided not to have these not to refer to the BRE guidance and to separate this guidance from it, as Alan explained in his presentation. I think as far as we're aware, the BRE guidance is the only guidance or national guidance that has any sort of numeric hours of daylight for sort of open space as a requirement. And we don't have another sort of the evidence for having another number, which would, so it would be, if there is the evidence out there, we'd welcome to see it. But it's obviously the document that BRE produces, it requires a number of different assessment methods and it's technical. And as I just sort of said, it's often difficult to actually interpret. So getting the outcome you want is probably easier to do in the way we've approached it. But if there is evidence for 6 hours or whatever number of hours during the the equinox points in the year, then we'd welcome to see it.
Okay, we'll all be paying close attention to the arguments that developers use for what isn't unduly overshadowed, and we may come back on that in a future date. And also, is the GLA doing anything to mitigate or asking for measures to mitigate any negative impacts on biodiversity that occur? I'm just asking the question to the air because I'm not sure which one of you is going to answer.
Sorry, I just obviously the point of this document is it's a bit of a sort of one-stop shop and points you to lots of different things. It links to the London Plan policies, but also points you to different London Plan guidance. And so the most relevant one for this is the urban greening factor. So this would apply to all major developments, and so they would need to conform to that policy requirement. And that would be setting out the what's required, and by achieving that, you're delivering the biodiversity, some net gains that would come from achieving your sort of UGF score. So that's the way that we sort of anticipate that, the way that you'd measure that.
Okay. Thank you. That's all. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Berry. And Elliot, if I heard correctly, it did sound like you were welcome to receiving some more evidence around sunlight and the minimum access to it. So I think perhaps after this meeting we could have a follow-up with Chris and we could facilitate that from the committee to ensure that some of that information is passed over. And you've got indicators. I don't know if you wanted to come in now, Chris.
No, I mean, to say exactly that, I remember I was wearing this shirt because it's got cornflowers on it.
Excellent.
So, but flowers have the number, I take your point about a number not being the answer, it's a whole set of factors, but nature does give you numbers because once you need about 6 hours for roses, dahlias, cornflowers, buttercups, lavender, so there is a whole bunch of flowers. So there is a measure coming from nature, but also from all these other there's scientific studies, so thank you.
Yeah, I mean, light is a big battleground, to use your words, and I think everyone on the committee is in agreement with that, and I think just from Elliot and Alan's perspective, I think it's really fantastic to have seen the movement from the original LPGs to removing the 2-hour minimum with an indication that that's actually not enough. So having the kind of, to use Assemblymember Berry's word, flexibility now in the language, perhaps we can build on that, and I do think it could be worth, as a follow-up from this committee, perhaps having Chris convene some of the people who've helped collate the evidence that's in his report to meet with yourself, Alan and Elliot, to continue that conversation to ensure that we get the best outcome. Great. I'm going to move us on to the last final questions, and that's back to Assemblymember Buff.
I just wanted to really understand whether or not these standards that were set out in the new draft LPGs, whether or not they're straightforward, practical, viable for architects and developers to implement. Perhaps, Ms. Gbolade, you might be able to respond to that.
Yes, is the short answer. In terms of if they're straightforward to apply, I believe so. I think the standards clearly follow a process that is necessary and that good designers would use anyway in terms of developments. Again, not necessarily just focused on a building or a set of flats, but actually taking that long view and taking that wider lens and thinking about the shared spaces. I think that they're written out in plain enough English to be used, and they're easy to apply. I do appreciate the fact that, of course, some point back to the London Plan, and all of these are built off the London Plan, specifically on the on the right-hand side on the standards, it highlights exactly where within the London plan each of these standards have sort of been brought in and expanded upon. So I thought that was really, really useful to see.
Thank you. Mr. Smithies, yes.
Yeah, no, thank you. I just wanted to build on Tara's point there, because one of the reasons we've highlighted to the London Plan policies is because ultimately, the standards are based on the policies within the London Plan itself. And coming back to your point about being deliverable and viable, the London Plan has got those policies, and it went through the robust examination in public, and part of that was assessing the viability of these different policies. And the housing standards LPG, ultimately is a one-stop shop, and it points you to these ones. So yeah, its supporting bit is the London Plan, which has been viability tested, I guess, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Right. But okay, Mr. Stronge, have you got a view on whether or not these are easy to follow?
Broadly, yes. I would say they're easy to follow. I would recommend that we do a kind of a final read through and ensure that no parts of recommendations are perhaps contradicting or overlapping others. I'll give an example around the policy around privacy, and perhaps inset balconies being quite a good way to manage that, have access to private open space and privacy. But also in the sustainability commentary, it says inset balconies aren't so great for your form factor or the amount of building envelope that you need to then insulate, for example. So there's a little bit of, there are some instances of we could read it through again and make sure that one part isn't contradicting the other. Another one is on podiums, for example, that ideally there's no grass, it's maintenance-free planting, it's more biodiverse and less need for lawnmowers. And then there's another part that says make sure there's a separate access up to the podium space for your lawnmower. So it just needs that kind of read through to make sure that the very good logic that's in and throughout it is followed through in each of the final clauses. Yeah.
So what's the relation between the design quality, the cost of the development, and subsequently the viability and affordable housing provision? I mean, what is that relationship?
In terms of its overall impact on viability, and I suppose in some ways, as long as the field is level and we're all purchasing land on the basis of the same rules, then it'll be as easy for Peabody to purchase it, or as difficult for Peabody to purchase it as a private, more profit-making developer. So if everybody's working within the same constraints, that will adjust itself through the land value in due course. I think where you get a little bit stuck is where you've bought land 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and you thought you were going to be able to build at a certain build cost, but because you've gotten planning a number of years later with a different set of goalposts, your base build assumptions would be thrown out as a result of that. So longer term, if everyone's working to the same goalposts, then the land value would adjust so that development continues at the rate of demand, etc. I do recognise that there are some best practice, so not stated requirements, but best practice suggestions around 5% additional floor area for oversizing, or I can't remember of another example, but room dimensions, for example, are slightly higher than we would even. We have our own in-house kind of design guidance, which ensures that rooms are habitable, etc. And the dimensions mentioned in here are slightly larger, maybe between 5 and 10% larger on your main living space width, for example. That has a knock-on effect on how many living rooms you have on one side of a building and the overall length of that building. And so if you add all those kind of constraints up, 5% on length, 5% on floor area, you're asking for the land value to kind of carry that those kind of extra build costs. So we just need to in the kind of the short term make sure we can implement as much as possible. But in the long term, it would work its way through in terms of adjusting land values.
So those are the kind of considerations that you bring into account when you're aiming to build some lower-rise, family-sized homes compared to taller and denser schemes. I mean, you're still building those kind of homes. So
I think when I was thinking about those examples, I was applying that to taller, denser schemes as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we have managed to finish 5 minutes early for this section. So what I will do is I'll give the guests a 1-minute opportunity to add any additional comments that they feel like they haven't been able to cover so far. So I'll start with you, Tara, if you wanted to. No need to do so if you feel like you've said everything you've come to say. Okay, no worries.
I suppose a final, as well as a read-through, I suppose the just watching that we don't overstep into other areas that are also evolving at the moment in relation to the building safety regulator and building regulations around safety, that we're getting certain kind of feedback from that route for planning applications that are also referred to that body. And an example might be mobility scooter storage and the safety of that. And so that we're bound to take advice and recommendations from the building safety regulator in due course, but that we don't overstep or try and do that job within this guidance at the same time.
Thank you, David.
Thanks.
Alan?
Yeah, just to say, you know, we welcome all these comments. Yeah, so.
Excellent summary. Andrea.
Hi, I've got a couple of comments
Go for it.
from Just Space generally, from Richard, that I also support. He says, if genuinely affordable housing comes up, Just Space does not favour this term as we feel it allows the delivery of housing, London affordable rent, that is not affordable to those in housing need. Just Space is less bothered about ensuring generally affordable housing targets are met and more concerned to have higher targets for social rented and community-led housing and to ensure that these are delivered. On daylight and sunlight, Just Space wants to see specific reference to all parks, gardens and play space having access to sunlight rather than general terms like amenity spaces. I just wanted to add to that some developments have seemed to have kind of encroached on what used to be public space, and so you end up in a situation with previously what was public realm becoming almost like private space. And I think that's something that I'd be keen to see, that these standards ensure that there's, I mean, it talks very favourably about amenity spaces being accessible to everyone, which is great, but somehow making sure that no public realm space gets lost in new developments. You know, access to rivers and creeks, for example, in Deptford and things like that, I think are really important. So I just wanted to add that. And community collaborative planning in terms of empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And I think that concludes. I always seem to forget to put my mic on. Maybe I think it's because I've got a loud mouth. It's been really great to have you. We've really enjoyed your comments, and I'm sure we'll be following up with you. I think there is a couple of follow-ups that will be noted, so hopefully the committee will continue working with you all. Yeah, we'll break now for, I think, 10-15 minutes. I'll bring this committee back at 3:30, so I'll adjourn us for now. Thanks very much, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to those who are watching online in the gallery and in person. We now have the second panel for this Planning and Regeneration Committee, and welcome to the guests for joining us. We're really grateful for your time and your expertise, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you. What I will ask is, before you begin speaking, just to introduce your full name and your title. You might have noticed from the agenda we have an ambitious amount of business to get through, so what we're going to suggest is, please, if possible, stick to the questions that have been asked to you by Assembly members, unless you're really keen to come in off the back of another question, in which case please just indicate to myself or the person asking the question. Just to give you some context, we are keen to demonstrate our geekiness on this committee. So we started the last panel with a 10-minute presentation, and we'll be doing the same for this one as well. So I'm sure you all already know, and those who will be watching will have seen from the agenda, that we will be looking at the topic of small site design codes, the London Plan guidance on this. And we will start with a 10-minute presentation from Alan. So Alan, I'll pass over to you. And as before, if you could just reintroduce yourself and your title.
Hello, yeah, thank you very much. So I'm Alan Smithies. I'm a senior strategic planner at the GLA, and I work in the London Plan team. So I'm just going to give a presentation on the Small Site Design Codes LPG, or London Plan guidance. Okay, so like the previous presentation, I'm just going to start with the aims of this LPG. So this document provides further guidance on policy H2 of the London Plan, and the creation of area-wide design codes by boroughs and neighbourhood planning groups. And these codes are intended to be a key mechanism for delivering a borough's small sites housing target, and also an increase in housing through incremental housing development across an area. And it does this in a way that is proactive rather than reactive. So this guidance encourages boroughs to front-load design issues and considerations of small sites to the plan-making stage. And when we say small sites, these are sites of up to 0.25 hectares, and they may include new build, infill development on vacant and underutilised sites, as well as upward extensions of existing buildings. And the intention is to encourage clarity on what is acceptable, or in some cases not acceptable, on certain small site conditions throughout a plan area. And this approach also aims to encourage more meaningful upfront engagement with local communities on the development of small sites in their area. And importantly, this is done at the plan-making stage rather than the planning application stage. And then lastly, a key intention of area-wide design codes is to raise the design quality of small sites being developed across London. So during the first consultation, which we've already mentioned, we received a wide range of feedback on this document, and this included a desire to set out the design coding process more clearly, for greater clarity on the community engagement part of the process, for more illustrations and small site exemplars to be used, and the suggestion that small site design codes could be linked to character types. Sorry. As a result, the document has been significantly revised to align with the National Model Design Code, and this includes advocating for the use of a coding plan, and we're also aiming to provide greater clarity on the expectation to undertake community engagement throughout the document. And we've also tried to encompass further illustrations and exemplar small site developments throughout the document. And we're also advocating for authorities to identify character types within their local area as a basis for the application of the area-wide design codes. So this was something that wasn't originally in the first document, Module B of the Good Quality Homes for All Londoners guidance. So during the second consultation, some of the key aspects of feedback that were received were as follows. So firstly, that the revised structure and alignment with the National Model Design Code was welcome. There was continued concern that local planning authorities may not have enough resources and skills to undertake the process set out in the guidance. And there was a desire to see more guidance on if and how area-wide design codes should be applied to conservation areas. And we are also aware that it would be advantageous to include specific wording and guidance on community-led housing and land trusts, as well as encouraging authorities to be aware of other housing needs in the local area, for example, like gypsy and traveller accommodation and specialist forms of housing. And lastly, there were a number of questions raised about the community engagement section as well. So in terms of how the LPG is supporting the delivery of small sites, this document sets out a process for how to create locally set area-wide design codes. As mentioned, this can be done by a local authority or neighbourhood planning group, and ultimately it is up to each authority and neighbourhood planning group to clarify what is appropriate in their area. In recent years, a number of reports have concluded that the proportion of small house builders is decreasing. As a result, one of the rationales for encouraging design codes is that it encourages more clarity and lead to higher levels of certainty for those looking to develop a small site. And this can specifically assist SMEs when looking to redevelop a site. And as part of this proactive approach to the development of small sites, the guidance also encourages authorities to identify and map small sites where necessary. This is something that the GLA's Small Site, Small Builders programme is already undertaking, and the hope is that this process of identifying sites can also support community-led housing and community land trusts. Our aim is also that authorities consider the most suitable and appropriate use for specific sites. This could be for residential development, but it could also be for other uses such as gypsy and traveller accommodation, specialist older persons housing, or supported specialised accommodation, for instance. Lastly, I just want to mention that there are similarities to the government's street votes concept. Although we haven't had much information on this concept, we feel that the GLA's approach provides a robust process for developing locally specific design codes. So one of the key aims of area-wide design codes is to improve the residential quality of small sites being developed in London. Rather than clarifying appropriate design in lengthy policy documents, design codes aim to provide the constraints of development as a set of simple, concise, illustrative design requirements that are visual and numeric wherever possible. And area-wide design codes also encourage a consistent approach to the redevelopment of small sites with the same characteristics or site conditions. An example is shown on the right-hand side of the screen there, where the top image shows a terrace with an inconsistent approach throughout the street to a roof extension, and the bottom shows a more consistent approach. We ultimately feel that this can help avoid a streetscape becoming fragmented. And then ultimately, design codes can help illustrate not only good practice, but also bad practice, which should be avoided. And the last thing to mention is that the LPG encourages the attachment of planning conditions that could be possibly used to reinstate original architectural features, which can assist in improving the design quality of small sites further. These are features that may have been lost through the passage of time, and examples of these include the reinstatement of missing cornices, downpipes, or cast iron railings, for instance. So this is the end of my presentation, and I'll pass over to the chair.
Thank you. And just to check if Elliot had anything to add to it.
No, I didn't. Thank you.
Grand. Thank you for that, Alan. So I'll start off with some of the points that you've already sort of mentioned, but maybe I'll ask you to dig in a little further, and following on the theme from our questions in the last section, just around that engagement, that community engagement. So in terms of this LPG, obviously specifically aimed at local authorities, how's that conversation with local authorities been in terms of the feedback of the evolving LPG? Can you sort of point to some examples of the constructive changes? And also, more broadly, how does the LPG encourage and work with local government to ensure meaningful engagement in their local design?
So sorry, just to clarify, your first question was about what feedback we've had from local authorities on the document.
Yeah, the evolution from the first to the second.
Yeah, so I think one of the key things was that I think they wanted more clarity on the process of how to undertake area-wide design codes, because I think there was some confusion over how that would be done in practice. And I think that's one of the reasons that led us to considering and ultimately putting in the process, which we now do, which is identifying character types as a basis of those area-wide design codes. And that process of identifying character types is set out in the Characterization and Growth Strategies LPG, so one of the other documents as part of the suite. Your second question was about community engagement.
Indeed. How does the guidance kind of offer mechanisms for local government to think about meaningful community engagement when they do develop their local design codes?
Yeah, so and this has been a key thing that we've wanted to reiterate in the guidance, and something that we feel very strongly we need to emphasise and reiterate. And we've tried to do that particularly in the, I think it's the stage 2 section of the document, which is about the design vision for design codes. So ultimately, in that section, we're saying that local authorities or neighbourhood planning groups should be consulting local residents, businesses, local communities on formulating these design codes. And we're also aware that there's possibly the potential as well that we might introduce some more guidance and some more wording in section 1, which also talks about identifying small sites, because we think that at the moment the LPG as it's written, I don't think places enough importance on consulting the community at that stage. And I think identifying small sites, and some boroughs are already doing this, that should be done in coordination with consulting local communities and residents.
Brilliant, thank you. I will push you a little further. So what do you think those mechanisms look like, those mechanisms of consultation? So I think we talk in the suite of documents about things like co-design, and ultimately also things like understanding street preferences, understanding and doing a preference of feedback on which areas could have scope for further intensification. So those are just a couple of examples. Does that answer your question? It's a good start. I'm sure we can pick that up afterwards. There's maybe one specific thing that I wanted to follow up on based on what you were talking about when you talked about the street votes concept that's incoming in the planning and regeneration, the sort of levelling up and regeneration bill. And you talked about how it might intersect with the locally specific design codes. Could you just offer some more insight on that and how you anticipate that? Because the committee will be coming on to discuss that in the autumn, so it'd be good to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so ultimately what is said in the planning and regeneration bill, I think it's just a placeholder, so there isn't really much to go on there. But in terms of the, I think it's the policy exchange report or document that sets out the concept of street votes, there are similarities. I think, we take an approach here in our approach that, identifying character types and then applying an area-wide design code on those character types. So these are all conditions. So, for example, we might be talking about terraces or, metro land estates, so areas of semi-detached housing that all have the same characteristics and architecture, and applying the design code on there. Whereas I think, with the street votes, potentially it's down to, individual streets. And I think ultimately our approach is that neighbourhood planning groups and local authorities will be the ones creating these. And I think I'm still, I guess, not sure about how the mechanism would work with the street votes concept, because I think that's quite, potentially...
Yet to be seen.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Sure, thank you. I'm going to move on to asking David a question. I wanted to ask, what benefits will the new design-led approach as set out in the 2021 London Plan, and this LPG specifically, bring to boroughs in maintaining the local character of their areas?
I think in general...
And David, sorry, just before you start, your full name and your title, please.
I'm so sorry. My name's David Ogumuyiwa. I'm an architect, also a mayor's design advocate, and in private practice as an architect.
Thank you.
I think in general, the application of design to these particularly small, tricky sites, often with lots of multiple constraints, often quite serious constraints, which is often why they're left over, often why they're kind of available as small sites, they're highly dependent on a kind of a governing design eye to look at how resolving and balancing all of those issues. And I think having a kind of clear framework that has a set of easily digestible kind of reference points and a kind of set of design languages that talk about appropriateness within specific terms takes a lot of subjectivity out of that, allows some control over both what is provided for the community, but also allows the developers, if they're local authorities, to be able to articulate that to local communities and have confidence that they can move forward with those without later on down the line, as Alan was saying, coming up against resistance to that, which often happens. We do, in my small practice, we do a lot of small sites infill, and even when it's 100% social housing, because of by the time it's got so far down the line, people have busy lives. They have very narrow bandwidth to understand this stuff until it's almost kind of at a planning stage. And when the resistance comes at that point, it's a lot more difficult to have those conversations. So I think this gives a lot of clarity to everybody. It gives a lot of reassurance to councils to be able to identify where to move forward. It gives a lot of reassurance to architects in how they talk about and articulate the benefit that these developments are going to create for the local community.
Fantastic, thank you, David. And Emma, if I could ask you the same question, please. Would you like me to repeat it?
No, I think you're talking about sort of proposed... Oh, sorry, Emma Talbot. I'm Director of Planning at the London Borough of Lewisham, and we have our own small sites, SPD, which we adopted in October last year. I mean, I think that if you're asking about how these secure design quality, I think that for us, what we wanted our SPD to do, and I think the opportunity that this provides, is early conversation with people about these sites, and not just the people that live there, but the people that own them and the people that are designing them. And so we wanted our SPD to be our voice when people are looking at these sites, and we wanted to encourage people to get an architect and get professional advice, and to understand that many of these sites aren't always left over. They're there for a purpose. What was that purpose? Understanding that, thinking it through, and then thinking through how we're going to approach it. So taking the cues from the surrounding area, and understanding of heritage and what that means. The real benefit that so many things that are can be seen as constraints on a site. A tree is an opportunity. It should not be a constraint. And getting that message very early on so that people manage their expectations about what their site can accommodate. And I think through that early conversation and really sort of the trying to demystify what the planning process is, because it is incredibly complex, and even more so for these sites. So I think removing as many barriers as we can only help to improve quality in its holistic sense, and not just the aesthetics. Because I mean, it's really, I'm obsessed with the detail of brickwork, but that's not enough. It's how it sits in a site, in an area, in a street, its relationship with neighbours. It's about setting the, quality is about speaking to your neighbours and your community groups very early on as you're looking at the concept, and encouraging that type of behaviour. So those are those are the things that we've tried to distill in our SPD to really try and demystify and think about that quality in a much more rounded way. But of course, it really has to look good. That's a given, and I think these could be an excellent toolkit to help local authorities set out what that means to them.
That's really helpful, and I think being obsessed with the detail of brickwork, you're speaking to the right people, but on both sides of the table, I think. That's really, I think, especially the specificity of the character of the local area that you've gone into, I think is really helpful for us to begin to visualise why the design codes are so important. And I think sort of just building on that, I think you sort of answered one of my questions, which is, the benefits of every local council having their own design codes. I think that's implied in a lot of what you've said. So I might flip it and ask, are you concerned about councils' resources more broadly in terms of being able to develop these design codes, and what challenges do you anticipate?
I mean, absolutely. I think resourcing is a concern, and I think it's a concern across the piece in the public sector. There aren't enough people to employ, and that is going to be a big barrier. We were very fortunate that we had funding through the Home Building Capacity Fund to bring in people to help us with this. We brought in a fantastic team, and it was also a team that went beyond the planning service. So although this is a planning document, we prepared it with our housing development team, and it was joint work between us and Regeneration. But if I was to be asked to do this again right now, post-COVID, with sort of less people out there in the market, we would struggle. And it's not just money that's a barrier. That is a barrier, but it is the availability of good people, and you need good people to do this and to engage in a meaningful way. That's it can't be one thing on a website. It's really involved if you want to bring people along with you. So yes, I think it is going to be a real struggle for authorities.
Thank you very much for that, Emma. Matthew, I might bring you in as well on this question, just in terms of the challenges, not just that maybe more broadly across London that local authorities face, but also if there's been any neighbourhood planning groups or communities that you've worked with or been made aware of that have faced challenges in engaging with local design codes and helping develop them.
I think there is major challenges. We published a report a couple of years ago which looked at capacity, design capacity across England, in this case not just in London. And it showed that there were major challenges in terms of design capacity across most local authorities, and a considerable concern about how they were going to deliver on this, renewed interest, if you like, in design and design quality. My view is that we shouldn't see this as something we're going to solve overnight. It's a long-term challenge. And documents like this and the National Model Design Code at the national scale, I think, are very useful in putting in place a framework that will allow local authorities over time to prioritise these issues, to invest, maybe do some training, use consultants and so forth. And, maybe we're talking 10 years before we'll be where we want to be in terms of actually having the capacity and the skills in place. So the critical thing is not to chop and change, not to suddenly change the policy and dump this overnight just because we haven't got the capacity now, but to think about how it can be built up over the long term.
Thank you. It's good food for thought. I'll pass over now to Assemblymember Baker for her questions.
Not fully on it, this committee, I have to say. My follow-up, my next question is to Emma, and it does follow up on some of the stuff that you've been saying about the community engagement and resistance in some cases. So do you have recent examples of where local authorities have used that community engagement when developing their design codes? And you've talked a little bit about the challenges in terms of residents' concerns and oppositions to densification. I don't know whether you wanted to expand a little bit further on what those challenges are and how the codes can help you get around them.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, when I talk about community consultation, I think if you start a conversation with the community and it's about a design code, it's probably a bit too late. And I think that was a lesson for us. So one of the things that helped us to do the design code was that we'd already prepared a character appraisal of the borough. And we consulted on it. We're not required to consult on that, but we did. And we met with the community and we asked a really simple question, which was, where do you think you live? And we started to plot that. And there were blurred lines. There were always blurred lines, but it really gave us a level of insight that then helped for this to be a continuation. The other thing that we showed were sort of lots and lots of examples of the good and examples of the bad. And we focused more on examples of the good because it was around, do you think this is good? How could we encourage this? What are the things that matter to you? And I think that, if you're asking someone what they think about the wording of, policy SL 36 criterion B, you've probably lost them. But when you're saying, where do you live? What do you like about it? Where do you think there are opportunities? The other thing was really honest conversations. And people are probably fed up in Lewisham of hearing me say this, but we're not being asked if there will be new housing. We're being asked where and how do you want it to look, and this is our opportunity to influence it. And I think that shared challenge of when we overlay public open space, conservation areas, and conservation areas don't mean no development, but they are more sensitive. When you overlay all of these parameters and then you put on a housing target, this is a shared challenge. How can we make sure that this is good? And that, for me, it's still a difficult conversation. And it's always easier when you're doing it around a document versus the actual scheme. But I hope that we've given people the confidence and helped them to understand how we look at things, and also the things that aren't up for grabs. So we've identified the sites that we think could come forward, but we've said gardens aren't included in that. And so if you happen to have a garden, we don't even want you to think about developing this further. And so that, I hope, gives people the confidence that we've listened. But it's a constant exercise, and it's one that you have to demonstrate constantly rather than talk about. I hope that sort of answered your question.
Yeah, it does. And I certainly find it reassuring to hear an acknowledgement. I know it won't be perfect, but an acknowledgement that consultation that's not just what you're required and that is earlier is such an important part of the process. So thank you for that. My next question is to Matthew and David. How does the LPG help boroughs to navigate the appropriate levels of densification? Obviously, this is a huge concern. And is there enough balance between providing housing and maintaining the access to green and social infrastructure? Is that strong enough in the LPG? Who wants to go first?
Well, I think the LPG sets out a process, sets out a framework, as Alan said. It doesn't necessarily say this is the right level of densification for your borough, or this is how you need to deal with greenness. But it sets out a process which, if local authorities go through that process, then I think they'll have a sort of much better chance of coming out the end with appropriate policies that communities will feel more able to back and that will be more sensitive in terms of their localities. So yes, it's about following the process, and I think this particular piece of guidance, I think, sets that out very clearly and very well and concisely, and it should be, I think, relatively straightforward for local authorities to engage with it and community as well to engage with it.
Yeah, I suppose from our point of view, as architects, often it's not up to us to make those particular judgments. What I would say is that as a practitioner, what we're aware of is that this document is part of a suite of broader documents that control those issues. We're always conscious from other documents and other kind of development control guidelines about the need to maintain green cover, that the need for access to daylight that you were speaking about earlier, the need to access for access to green space and urban greening factor and social amenities, and looking at developments and infill sites like this, not only as kind of housing plots, but also as somebody was, there was in the conversation this morning, somebody was talking about it as kind of urban infrastructure. It's the same as, it does more than one thing, and it contributes to the broader neighbourhood and community in lots of ways, and that also has to be acknowledged and made space for. And I think one of the, just to kind of go back to something that Emma was pointing out earlier, absolutely, we don't just look at bricks. We look at a kind of holistic, broader sense of what impact these developments can make and how they can actually be a lot more than themselves in lots of tangible and intangible ways, in lots of design ways, but also in the kind of meaning of what your neighbourhood means and the kind of character of your experience of that environment as well. And hopefully we'll touch on certain things in terms of kind of opportunities for diversity and kind of more people kind of having access to these processes as well further down the line.
Thank you. So just to reflect back to you, so with your architect's hat on, what you're saying is if boroughs do follow these codes, then by the time you're getting involved, it's much less likely that you're going to input something that's not going to be found appropriate by the local community. Is that, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd like to think that most responsible architects would be responsible about that from the outset. But what this does do is it creates a kind of it creates a kind of datum that everybody understands that, good responsible architects do this sort of thing and look at the world in this sort of way. And more importantly, and as Emma said, articulates it in this sort of way, not just about what's the built form that's going on that site, but also all of the things that are there. A tree is absolutely not a constraint. I wouldn't consider it as a constraint. But there might be. We're working on a scheme at the moment. There's a high voltage electrical cable that nobody knew was there under the ground. We worked just put something in for planning with a massive railway viaduct behind it. That's very tricky, and we're right next door to an operating premises. So there are lots of things in kind of existing London's dense, chaotic built form that provide opportunities but also need negotiating and need everybody to be on the same page about what that means and what can be generated from that.
That's brilliant, thank you. I've got one further question, Chair, but I think Assembly Member Berry's going to come in briefly.
Either here or at the end. Yeah, do you want to do your next question?
You are going to change something?
Yeah.
Apologies, right, somewhat, okay. So my last question is around how the LPG might benefit efforts to deliver homes that meet the needs of different groups of Londoners and our diverse communities. For instance, although there'll be huge numbers of examples, for instance, housing for older Londoners. This question is to Lev and David may have views as well. So I should have warned you at the beginning. This question was for you, shouldn't I?
I don't know
just
that
to start with a full introduction. Of yourself,
sorry,
please.
yes, Levant Caramel from Community-Led Housing London. We're hosted by a small housing association called CDS Cooperatives. I don't know that having looked at the document, whether it makes specific reference to what the housing should be, it doesn't talk about it. So that might relate to other policies in terms of affordability or who the residents might be. So I don't know that.
I suppose in terms of different groups of Londoners, different communities might want or need different things from their housing, especially if and sometimes that just isn't taken into account at all at the design stage. So and that's a real shame. Not everyone just wants to live in exactly the same housing and exactly the same. So I wonder whether you think this code allows that to happen more at a design stage.
I mean, definitely in terms of the groups we work with, people are constantly trying to do something different to the norm. Either that's because of how they want to live, how they need to live, the way people are included or housed or allocated housing, etc. I don't see very much in the document at the moment that sort of either promotes that or necessarily stops that. It's sort of ambivalent on it, I'd say. There could be more in terms of, I mean, one area I've got is around how people share amenities, share facilities, and I know there's another bit of policy around kind of large-scale shared living. I don't know whether there's any requirement. It's just kind of open and unspecified at the moment. I think the other point I would say is, and this might come up on other questions, but how those sites are accessed. So whether community groups are really involved in the design at all, or once the site is identified, who the landowner is and who's doing the development, probably have a much greater influence that this document doesn't necessarily allow a community group to be involved or to have a voice in that process. So.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think we are going to come back to that a bit more. But that's really, really helpful. David, do you have anything to add on?
Just to broadly agree with that, I think that there's what it sounds to me is that there is a question, a broader, wider question that has all scales and typologies about how we live and the amount of choice we've got over kind of how that is and whether it's shared and who delivers that and who brings that forward and how they're supported. And I know Lev's organisation does brilliant work. I'll let Alan come in.
Alan, come in. Sure.
Sorry, do you mind if I just come in? I guess it was just about the point, and Matthew, you've already mentioned it, about how the document is about the process of design codes, and I think we've tried in the document to highlight getting that right balance between flexibility and being too prescriptive, and I think that comes to some of your points about delivering housing which might have different needs, and I think getting a balance between those two things is important when thinking up design codes, creating these design codes. You'll need to be quite prescriptive in certain aspects, but you'll also need to leave flexibility in other aspects, being aware of people like to, live in different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
That's helpful, and thank you. Yeah, and I suppose we'll take a view about whether neutrality is enough we need in this particular document, or whether actually we'd want something stronger than that, I suppose.
And just before I bring in Assemblymember Berry, just to sort of also just flag that the question around diverse communities and how small sites can help deliver housing for it. I know that Lincoln will be bringing you in very soon to discuss Gypsy, Rum and Traveller communities and how small sites can help further the agenda of ensuring adequate housing for the communities that you work with. I'll pass over to Assemblymember Berry.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to go back to some of the issues that I brought up at the last session, the last part of this session, around housing design codes in specific relation to small sites, because I'm looking at David there, because I think you might be the best person to answer this question. But also it was brought up by Emma from Lewisham, this idea of gardens being something that needs to be more protected. So are you confident, David, that the new guidance here will prevent the selection of play space and green space as small sites? Because I do see that across London, particularly on estates, people, council selecting the play space that exists, the green space that exists as somewhere to build upon. Are you confident that will be prevented by this?
How best to answer that question? I think that this often starts with who is kind of running the design code and who's the author and owner of that design code and who's sharing it. Obviously, enlightened developers like Emma's department are really aware of also the kind of communal space and the other benefits that of space and don't build on green space. I'm not sure that's particularly a design issue at that point. I think what we would always try and do as designers is maximise the space. Apart from anything else, we're also thinking about complying with lots of guidelines that mean you have a certain amount of amenity space, a certain amount of children's play space, a certain access to natural daylight, a certain aspect to a certain access to dual aspects where possible. So there's a bunch of technical criteria that we have to meet, and even beyond that, our own particular values mean that we'd always try to maximize that. But I think one of the things that might come out in the conversations, because once you're having these conversations, from my experience with people about the character of where they live, these things come up really quickly and they come up really early, and then we can start to have that conversation. So in that context, then certainly I think this allows that conversation to take place in a very structured, straightforward, honest way.
Okay, yeah, and the other thing that you sort of hint at there is the impact that taking away that green space might have on the amenity of the surrounding area. I'm not sure that's being treated as a planning consideration when selecting a site for a development. The site is required to provide for the residents in the new development this amount of space, but the impact it's had on the people around isn't particularly considered. And that is it's not so much in the small sites design itself, but it's in the selection of the small sites that can have an impact.
That's fair enough. I mean, part of other roles that I do is also as a design reviewer, and that's one of the things we always pick up. And I think one of the things I enjoy about this document is the use of the word incremental, because it puts a responsibility on everybody who's wielding this to understand that this is part of a broader kind of neighbourhood. It's not just by itself, it's not just in isolation, it is part of a neighbourhood, and it needs to contribute that, not kind of extract value and opportunity and amenity from it.
Okay, and then finally, I wanted to ask your view on the example given in the guide. Sorry to refer to a page number, but it's figure 4.8 on page 21. I don't know if you have it in the guidance. It's a worked example of what you do with green cover and landscaping on a backland site. And I looked at that and was quite disturbed by it, because in the site as it stands, which is some garages, and it's got some green space within that and a tree, two of the things that have got big green ticks by them on page 22, the next page, take away the tree for what I can see is no good reason, and also just build willy-nilly over the existing space. And to my mind, as someone who's interested in biodiversity more generally, you're paying it's green and there's a green roof put up there, but you're paying no attention to the really valuable biodiversity in soil and the land that's there. And there's nothing in the guidance that says, preserve the footprint of the existing green space if you can. I can see loads of reasons I'd object to those developments there that have got the green ticks on them, because they're not preserving, they're just merely re-providing, and often with roof instead of ground. Do you have a comment on that? And perhaps we can ask for that to be improved.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment in this particular instance, in that particular drawing. Again, I think that's it's unusual that we're getting rid of trees. We're often not allowed to. They're often protected, and it's often I imagine if this was part of a conversation about this design code, a lot of people would say similar to what you've just said. And I think, but from my point of view as a designer, that helps guide what we then provide. So I don't think this is a thing that we have to follow. This isn't kind of it's a code, it's a guide. It's not this particular drawing isn't something we have to follow slavishly, I think.
Alan, you put your hand up.
I just want to recognise that that's a good point you raise. I agree. I know it's about a process, but I guess it's also about the direction that we're showing here, and I think probably the removal of that tree doesn't set a great precedent. So yeah,
it might set a nasty precedent that we then spend our time trying to defend later.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Berry. Now over to the committee's Deputy Chair, Assemblymember Best.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Matthew, coming to you first. How effectively does the Small Site Design Code's LPG balance certainty with flexibility?
I think it comes back to a point that's been made a few times, that in a sense this is about setting out a process that others will then follow. And it's in that sense, it's the codes that are produced by the local authorities or the developers that follow on from this that need to balance certainty and flexibility. And that's always a challenge. I would tend to say that that codes produced by authorities should try and concentrate on those matters which are really critical. Trees was one of them that's just mentioned, the preservation of trees or planting of trees, those type of factors that are seen as really critical for the public interest. And publicly produced codes should try and steer away from factors that are maybe less significant for the public interest, like perhaps the style of the architecture, for example. And in that area there might be more flexibility. But as far as the LPG itself, I think it sets out a process which hopefully others will follow, but it's not saying, and I think it shouldn't say, you should do this, 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 and this. There needs to be flexibility, I think, in the system to recognise the fact that every local authority is different. They have different in-house capacity and design skills, and they're structured differently, and they have different issues on the ground, and therefore they need to be able to flex the process to meet their own particular requirements. So, and I think the balance is right in this document.
That's good. Alan, I just wanted to ask you off the back of that last conversation in particularly, whether a couple of things that stood out to me is just the words of underused in the LPG. And Sean was touching on the green space and playground space, which often is termed underused. As well, we see it surface car parks on high streets underused. Could the LPG go slightly further in determining what underused looks like, which may serve some of those protections?
Yeah, I'm sure it can do. I think we've tried to do that by providing some of the images throughout the document. So, we have tried to provide images that show, if it's an underused car park or, set of garages, for example, to illustrate that's what we mean. But I think if it isn't clear enough, then that could definitely be something that we could look into.
Thank you. Yeah, I think an image can be interpreted a million ways for a million different purposes, depending on how one might want to interpret it. So I think some wording or around that that kind of better specifies what underused means would be much appreciated. Emma, coming to you, please. In your view, does the LPG ensure suitable protection for existing communities, businesses and family homes currently located on what would be considered small sites?
I think, I go back to what Matthew has said, that this is, for me, the LPG sets out a process, and it is for the local authority to make sure that when they're recognising certain types of small sites and what is valuable, and building on that, you're talking about underused. When you said that, I wrote down, by who? Who are we? It's a question to ask, and I think that the role of the LPG. For me, can really sort of set those early questions and those early conversations that need to be had around how is something used, and being honest about that, because generally it's valued by someone. I'm not sure that there's any such thing as an underused green space anymore after the last couple of years. I think there probably was a couple of years ago, but I just don't think there is anymore. We do have a housing challenge, though, and we have, and these things are going to happen. I come back to that earlier point of making sure it's good. So I do think it's within the ability of a local authority within their design codes to say that the role that a small site is playing, it may be that it's playing such an important role that it is not suitable for redevelopment. And for us in Lewisham, we need more family housing. Our larger sites, they tend to come forward with smaller units, which means that we want to protect our family homes. And we have policies within our local plan that protect those. So it's part of that suite. It's not going to be the only answer. And I think that it can be a really useful toolkit for setting out how we think about things, the type of questions that we ask and the type of conversations that we've had, so that we've got something locally specific.
That flows really well into my next question I was going to put to you, Emma, is that do you think that the design codes can be used effectively to protect suburban character, especially low-rise neighbourhoods where those existing family homes are that we know there's a shortage of growing in London? And you've just confirmed for me there in Lewisham too.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is where they can be really valuable in those street situations where you've got, the infill. So it's one of the things that we've developed in the code, and it was an area of debate with the architects that we had working on this, was the importance of the building line and floor to ceiling heights. And I was, pretty fixed on consistency, and there will be departures because we live modern lives now, and so when you're in a Victorian terrace, if you're going to meet current building regulations, you cannot just rebuild what was there, so it has to be that modern interpretation. But what we've set out is how you take the cues from the street, what is valuable, and also I think importantly, it's we've just touched on this, that balance between certainty versus flexibility. So one of the things that we've done, and I think the ability of this LPG that I think is in there, is it sets design vision. And I think that's the thing that holds through everything. There is always going to be one site that is so special, that is unique, that it needs its own solution. But what you can't waver from is that vision, that quality, and that process. So I think that there are the tools in this to do that and to look at those situations really well. Yes.
Thank you. And just moving back to you, Matthew, if that's okay. What opportunities would design codes offer to support co-housing or community-led housing schemes on small sites?
I don't think they would offer more or less than for any other type of housing. I think one thing that we have to remember is that the design code is just a tool, and it's part of a suite of tools that starts from the London plan and has all the different types of London-wide guidance, and then the local authority has their plan and they have their guidance and so forth. And it's entirely appropriate that in particularly local plans and in the London plan that there are policies that deal with different types of housing and housing need and so forth. It's not necessarily the sort of thing that you find in a design code. Because the design code tends to deal with more the physicality of the place and the structure of the place and so forth. But it needs to work hand in hand with the other tools at the disposal of the local planning authority.
Thanks, Matthew. And Lev, could I put the same question to you, please?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. If it's just a design code, it doesn't do much. The bit in this document that is potentially interesting is where sites are being identified on a map, and that's potentially quite radical because it sort of implies something a little bit like the Schlar process, where landowners who may have a site identified go, oh, hang on, I didn't think I could develop on that, but there's an implied sort of maybe you should consider developing that. I was just trying to look at the Lewisham document, which is really great, by the way, but I don't see that they have identified particular sites. So I think that's interesting. I don't think even that really doesn't provide any sort of support for kind of co-housing, community-led or self-build even though it's potentially quite common for very small sites to be one dwelling intended for the future resident. I think you would probably need to go a step further and almost designate them in some way, or designate a proportion of them to say this is specifically for self-build or for community-led or for co-housing or whatever, if you wanted to go that way. That's about it.
Yeah, and one final question, sir, on those small sites, and come back to you, Emma, because I thought it was really important when you raised earlier. Obviously, the earlier you get the community in and are honest about the challenges, I think, like you, I agree, the better. And the community then are best placed really to pick up those small sites. And the earlier you can get the community into that conversation, saying how where could we build, where would be acceptable, and small sites are often very hard to find, and obviously often those little nuggets that local authorities haven't seen, a certain batch of garages or something like that. How have you done that effectively, and how could that be perhaps bulked up, I think, in the LPG? Because I think perhaps some more guidance on how on the local consultation bit on identifying small sites would be helpful.
Yeah, I think that as our SPD predates the LPG, we haven't gone and identified specific sites. We have mapped the London Plan policies about where there will, highly accessible locations and things like that. So we've looked more at types. But what we're really proud to have in Lewisham is two neighbourhood plans that have been through their referendums and are adopted, and that's working with our neighbourhood groups for them to identify where there are local opportunities has worked well. So yeah, I think it is something that I think it's really hard to do as a local authority. If you want to have honest conversations about how is something valued, and you're shading on a map, there's a big risk of getting that wrong. And I think that would be, to do that genuinely, would be a significant piece of work. So I think it's where you have those neighbourhood groups, and we don't have them everywhere, but that for us has worked really well, and I think is perhaps complementary to the work that we do with this SPD, with our alterations and extensions one, and that suite of documents, and also some of the master planning that we've done, where we've gone out with groups early on and walked an area with them and asked them what they like about it and what they don't, and the things they want fixed, and we've used that to inform our New Cross master plan. Some of those sites are on a bigger scale, but I think that is incredibly intensive, really valuable. But I think you have to do that well, and that would be a massive task, I think.
Thank you very much. Just going to bring in Assembly Member Berry.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to Lev from Community-Led Housing London. You were very polite just now. You said something along the lines of, for the small sites policy and the designation of the identification of sites to be useful to community-led housing, there would need to be some kind of designation. Do you not want to just ask us for that, so that we can maybe consider it as a recommendation in a more direct way? Not that we can provide it, but would you want that to happen?
I mean, I know examples, for example, in Switzerland, visited recently, probably similar things in Germany, where they do make specifically, in their SCHLA or equivalent documents, they will say this is for cooperative housing, this is for other housing, or like conventional housing. So
we've discussed policies like that
because if you don't have something like that, all you're doing is identifying sites that the landowner will develop in the conventional way or sell, and it'll be the same competitive process. Currently, this is just a bit of background, I suppose, most of the community-led housing projects are hugely dependent on council sites, council-owned sites, and it's the goodwill of the council to even if a group isn't necessarily trying to achieve sort of higher than policy levels of affordable housing, just having the time to pull the money together to make an offer for a site or have that somewhat deferred and make it subject to planning is something you wouldn't really have the opportunity to do with a private sector landowner. So unless there's some other planning policy designation, I don't see how that's going to happen. I can see it's quite challenging to do that and pick on individuals and say, right, you're going to have this suppressed land value, whereas someone else isn't. So I don't know how you would go about deciding which sites should be more suitable for community-led housing as opposed to others. But it would be the thing that kind of makes it beyond just identifying sites. I think that's sort of, you know, fine, but relatively passive.
Fair enough. Thank you. Sorry, it was the Housing Committee who's previously looked at considering policies like that, and it has been for public land specifically.
Thank you, Assemblyman Berry. I'm going to turn to Alinka. Just to remind you to introduce yourself in full when you do start, and it's great to have you join the committee this afternoon. I know that we've been working closely with you to firstly have a site visit more recently with the sort of London Gypsy Traveller community, so it's really fantastic to have you here to build on that work. So the first question we wanted to put to you was, how important are small sites when it comes to Gypsy and Traveller accommodation?
Thank you very much. I'm Ilinka Diaconescu, Policy and Campaigns Coordinator at London Gypsies and Travellers. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, feel free to bring it closer to you if you want.
Sure. Yeah, so I think as land availability for Gypsy and Traveller sites is one of the key barriers, and through site allocation, local plan processes, we've probably only had a handful of site allocations coming forward across the whole of London in the last 10 years or more. That's not really an effective process to identify land to meet this accommodation need. And similar to what Lev was saying, it is highly dependent on council and public-owned land. So we kind of see small sites as a potential source of more likely possible locations, especially as it can be a proactive exercise that's kind of in parallel or outside of the local plan processes. And in talking to members of Gypsy and Traveller communities across London, I think people are increasingly more in favour of smaller sites which can accommodate kind of a group of families or extended families. They could be more viable, deliverable, and easier to manage as well. And actually quite a few community members are coming up with, you know, identifying themselves different locations in their boroughs for small sites, but not always sure what the process is if it doesn't happen to fall within a kind of local plan consultation period. It's quite difficult to bring those up with local authorities. So I think this can be a really good opportunity. I think as well, just the history of how a lot of local authority Gypsy and Traveller sites have been built in London. They tend to be between 10 and 20 pitches. There are some outliers that are 30, 40 families. Those are quite large sites, but there are quite a few examples of smaller sites from like a one family pitch within a terraced housing street in Camden, another one on a street corner, some other street facing sites in Hackney, some kind of more backland ones, which are all under, you know, the 0.25 hectare limit. So I'm not saying they're very well designed necessarily, but they are, you know, examples of what exists in London and is part of kind of diverse, you know, accommodation provision. And also I've seen a couple of boroughs are making some allocations in local plans for smaller sites. So it would be beneficial to have Gypsy and Traveller accommodation alongside other specialist housing mentioned explicitly in when we talk about design codes. And I would say particularly because there is no kind of design guidance or standards for Gypsy and Traveller accommodation at the moment. there was national guidance which was deleted in 2015. So there isn't much in terms of good practice, innovation, conversations between community members and architects, designers, planners to drive forward this type of housing provision in a way that is up to date and modern and can really help to reframe how Gypsy and Traveller accommodation is perceived, how the communities are treated and perceived by neighbours. And yeah, having some kind of design guidance standards can help with reframing those perceptions, and also to ensure higher environmental quality, because a lot of Gypsy and Traveller sites historically have been located in very poor quality areas. So this would all contribute to kind of more inclusive, more integrated provision for the communities. Can I just start? I mean, this is in terms of the small site design codes, and I agree with colleagues, people here who have said we don't necessarily need something very prescriptive, but I think actively mentioning these different types of accommodation to encourage developers, local authorities, etc., to actively consider types of housing that aren't as viable, etc., is really important. And kind of separate to that, because small sites is only one part of the kind of potential delivery of Gypsy and Traveller accommodation. There's, from our perspective, a need for London-wide design guidance or standards for how this type of accommodation is delivered, managed, and we feel there's important role that the GLA can take in driving that work forward to fill that gap, as there isn't any kind of national or London-wide or local guidance in that issue.
That was incredibly helpful, thank you, and I hope I've grabbed you, Alan. I hope the colleagues, I think, will be listening to what you're saying. I think it feeds into a lot of what Lev's been talking about in terms of site allocation and designation and the benefit of doing that, particularly hearing from you for the Gypsy and Traveller community. Alan, I'm going to kind of tie in a question for you as well as what you sort of indicated you want to come in on, and this is for yourself from the GLA perspective in terms of how you can encourage councils to do this, but also, Emma, if it's all right to bring you in terms of the capacity for local councils to do this, which is indeed be able to designate small sites, either for community-led housing or, as Alinka has talked about, the Gypsy Roma Traveller accommodation. What is the capacity for that, and the likelihood of it, and what have the conversations around that been like? Who's going to go first?
I'll start. So yeah, no, thank you very much for that, because I think we hear that and that makes a lot of sense. I think one of the things that came out of the most recent consultation is just about when identifying small sites, should we be making a bit more reference or pushing authorities to consider the wider housing need of a plan area, and that might include things like Gypsy and Traveller accommodation and other forms of specialist housing. And I think that, and I think Matthew, I think you touched on it as well earlier, but just reiterating that, small site design codes generally are aimed at the kind of more replicable types of sites, but we have been clear in the guidance that you can be identifying small sites. That's not, that's probably going to be on the kind of larger end of small sites, and it's at that stage that we're starting to think, maybe we can provide a bit more wording to say that, you should be considering these wider housing needs, and it might be possible actually that particular sites are more suitable for Gypsy and Traveller accommodation, or indeed through that process of identifying sites, it might come up that, this particular site could be, a community-led housing trust could take advantage of that site, and that would be the starting point of that. Again, these are for those specific sites which are likely to be the kind of more unique sites, and then obviously the design codes per se are for those more replicable types of sites, your upward extensions or your infills on streets. But that's just what I wanted to add there. Appreciate you.
Can I just come back? So it does sound like between now and autumn there is the possibility that we might see in the final guidance specific mentions of specific types of accommodation that could be better placed for small sites. So whether that's gypsy and traveller accommodation or community-led housing, to have that specificity in the small sites LPG that will be released in the autumn could be very beneficial as a local guidance. So it sounded like that was close to a commitment from you.
Well, I might have to defer to Elliot, but I think what I don't know about a separate piece of guidance, if that's
not
what
a
you're
separate,
talking.
integrated in the current piece of guidance.
Yeah, I mean, I think potentially what we're looking at is adding in some wording to make it clear that at a particular stage in the process that local authorities or neighbourhood planning groups should be thinking about the wider needs of the plan area, and that might be gypsy and traveller accommodation, or it might be an opportunity for community-led housing, for example.
I think if you're looking for feedback from the committee, I think it's clear that that's something that we would be really supportive of. So we really hope that's been taken on board. But I'll let you continue on to your second point.
Okay, no, that's good to know then. I think your other point was about just what is the capacity to do so, and I think that is ultimately we're asking local authorities and neighbourhood planning groups to go through an area analysis, and it's all part of a process, a suite of documents. So through the characterisation and growth strategies, and ultimately we're trying to provide tools and levers for and encourage those authorities to do certain things. So I think our approach is that they're already doing these exercises. It's a case of, okay, right, we've identified this particular site, this could be useful, and then that is the opportunity to then think about, okay, well, how best is this site provided, if you like, or re-provided. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but
no, I'm satisfied with that. Thank you, Alan. And Emma, just from a local authority perspective on the point around the specificity of the type of accommodation that could be designated on small sites, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question that sort of I've been sat here mulling it over as I've heard it, because the way that we approached it, because I think what I think there's the opportunity to do with a small sites design code is show people that there are opportunities on these sites, and some of the people that we want to speak to are those community-led housing. I've got to say, I don't think Gypsy and Traveller community is one that that feeds into our that is reflected in our small sites SPD. That said, we have been through a separate site selection process, and we are allocating a site in our local plan, which is about to go to Regulation 19 stage. So it's an interesting point about that as I think a missing item, because there's certainly the willingness to do that, and I think it's more guidance around that is helpful. Not only to identify suitable sites, but I think that that is a type of accommodation that causes lots of comments, lots of objections, painted as, oh, but surely this site isn't suitable, and to be able to helpfully say, oh, good news, it is, I think would be a really worthwhile role of that. But to go back then onto the community housing, we've got a really strong history in Lewisham of community-led housing and some really successful sites, some recent that are on site in Church Grove, and others that have been there for a very long time with our Seagull houses, Nubia Way. And so that is something that we've approached as, here's the opportunity. But we haven't designated any land for anything in the code. But I think promoting the ability of a small site on its own might not be suitable, but a collective coming together and helping community groups to be competitive in a competitive market, because that's not something that the planning system can remove from the process unless it's a local authority being involved in providing the land. So, I mean, I don't think I have the answers to either of those, but they are really good points, and that I think that there are the hooks within there that at a local level we can all start to think about those and how we can best do it, because they can be, when they work well and they're planned well, people live better lives in housing that they can afford, connections to the local area, their children go to our schools, that improves everybody's lives. So it's really worthwhile, I think, as an extra piece of work for us to focus on.
No, that's fantastic, and it sounds like perhaps one follow-up from this might be yourself and Alinka having a catch-up in Lewisham sometime that I might gate crash. We are ahead of time, which is good news for everyone. So I'm going to use this as an opportunity either to ask the committee members if they had any follow-up questions that they wanted to ask. Otherwise, 1 minute conclusion from any of our guests who feel like they might not have said everything that they came to say. So I'll start off with committee members if there's any remaining questions you have. Assembly Member Buff.
Only to Ms. Diakonescu.
It's a bit mumbly at the end of the day, huh?
I just wondered, do you think that this design guide is going to prevent this situation of Gypsy and Roma traveller sites being put next to motorways?
Well, I don't know what's going to be in the design guide, so...
Because it does seem a default position sometimes for local authorities. They put these the traveller sites in the most inhospitable places, and they put them in their planning documents, and they spend years and years working towards those particular sites, only to discover that it's an unhealthy place for people to live. Do you hope that these guides will prevent that situation from happening again?
I think if the design guides are seen alongside other processes like identifying land more proactively and looking at more potential locations, if we've got a design guide that reframes what Gypsy and Traveller accommodation is meant to be, which at the moment is perceived as something that's out of sight, doesn't look very good, it's not in a good location. But if it starts to build that bridge and make it more kind of, not acceptable, but make it more normalized as a form of housing, as a type of accommodation that meets diverse needs and is more integrated in a local neighborhood, I think it can have that effect in the longer term, that hopefully really terrible locations will be avoided.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I reiterate that. Thanks. And I think it's also worth saying, so much of what the committee's heard both here but also at the site visit is really informing the needs assessment that the GLA is undertaking. And I think Assemblyman Buff was correct to highlight that what we're keen to do at the GLA is push local councils to do better, and part of doing that is having a more expansive definition of what it means to need assess the Gypsy Roma traveller community, so that you actually include those who are in bricks and mortar as part of those who should still have accommodation provided. So I know that work is ongoing for the next 8 months, and we'll continue to be working with you on that. Right, I think it's nearly a wrap, folks, unless anyone on the panel would like to add any final closing comments. Please, David.
Thank you. I just wanted to say for the record, one of the things I appreciate about this document is, in particular, I think Emma mentioned earlier a simple question. I think there's also a simple question about who designs London. That London has been particularly bad at that over the years. I think a kind of diverse authorship and diverse involvement in the conversation about local environments is really important for everybody to feel part of, both at a community level but also at a consultant level. I was really interested in the conversation about local authority capacity and how consultants might contribute to that. I think there are lots of, frankly, there's capacity in other places that hasn't always been kind of thought about in that context, and I think that helps with a kind of local democracy and people buying in. It's not just this kind of expectation in certain kind of dense, complex inner city areas about kind of privileged people designing commodities and homes for even more privileged people, and it's about how everybody, for the benefit of all Londoners, can have access to small development opportunities and improve the volume of small house builders across communities, and contribute to those communities economically as well as local business and so on and so forth. I think that's a really important and underrated aspect of something that this begins to define. This document begins to define and specifically target.
No, absolutely, couldn't agree more. And I think particularly post-pandemic, people's lived experience of their local areas particularly heightened in their minds, which is why the committee was keen to explore it in this session. So thank you for highlighting that point. Whether it looked like Lev, you had closing comments as well, and Matthew.
I might add something which might not be directly linked to this document, but the conversation around designation and the sort of link between community-led housing and small sites. I think there definitely is a link, but it's also not to forget that it might be suitable to include community-led housing on larger sites. So the MPPF talks about identifying the demand for people who want to build their own homes, so things like self-build, etc. Many local authorities outside of London see that as on a larger site, a proportion of the plots might be for kind of self-build. I think in London, clearly, there isn't that much of individual one-off houses happening in on larger sites, but I think thinking about blocks that maybe a large developer is co-designing, co-producing with a group, that the ownership then transfers. It doesn't have to be that the community group has to do the development themselves, as long as they're involved in that process. And maybe thinking about a proportion of, I don't know, 1,000 unit scheme, a small block goes to a community-led group is also worth thinking about.
That's really helpful food for thought. And finally, before I lose my committee members, Matthew, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I think just to make the point that these sorts of sign codes are so fundamental. I think for too long we've relied on just sort of words in plans. This is about getting in place that skeleton, that physical skeleton of the city on which a really good city made of really good quality places can grow. And so I think this is a really welcome document, and I think that the GLA should really push hard to get this implemented down at the borough level. Just come back, one last thing on the Gypsy and Traveller issue. It seems to me that we've heard that there's no national guidance anymore, there's no London-wide guidance, so it seems, not necessarily in this document, but it seems that there's a big gap there for some London-wide guidance, design guidance for sites for gypsies and travellers.
That's what we're working on. Well, that's really, really helpful, a really positive note to end on. The committee hopes to work with you all again in the future. We've really valued your contribution, so many thanks for coming and joining us today. We've got a few more bits of business to do, but maybe stay seated, actually, if that's all right, just for a couple of minutes while we whiz through it. But yeah, very grateful for your time, everyone. Thank you very much. Committee members, can we note the report on today's discussion? Can we delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any outputs from the discussion? And can we note the committee's work programme that's in the agenda that doesn't mention the specificity of the March committee, but that will be confirmed later? Agreed. Fantastic. And this has also been confirmed at the GLA Oversight Committee meeting. And can we note the recent activity undertaken, namely the Gypsy and Traveller site visit and discussion with community members? can we delegate authority to me as chair of the committee following consultation with group lead members to agree any output from the site visit? The date of the next committee meeting is 7th of September 2022 at 2 p.m. in the chamber. I have no other urgent business, so with that I bring the meeting to a close. Thank you very much, everyone.